Yeah. Also, I was just thinking, all the wars, it seems more or less related, right? That if you look at World War I and World War II, World War II can be saying is like a extension of World War I in a way. I feel it's very much related. And then what World War II did, I mean, I feel like that during the World War II, there were fightings, of course, and then there were meetings and negotiations. So they seems like had agreement on how to divide the world, right? That they had meetings. Now, what they did was how to divide Europe, East and West, the Soviet bloc and the US bloc. They did that pretty clearly. What they didn't do is they didn't divide, or arrangement was not set up in Asia. Now that's, I think, part of the reason after World War II, Asia has so many
Yeah.
wars: the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Afghanistan War, even Indonesia
Mm.
coup. I mean, all these things seems related to the fact that the World War II does not have a clear arrangement for Asia. Part of it, I guess, because the US think they have China in the bag. And so as long as that's the case, they had the Asia more or less. But of course, that's why they were so angry that they lost China. Do you think that's what why
This
we
is exactly this is right. This is correct, but I think that a little bit of explanation of the history might be useful. The key thing to understand is that the world wars, World War One and World War Two, insofar as they related to Europe, never really were resolved. Now, the plan was, the intention, the agreements that were made during the Second World War between the Allies was that after the Second World War, there would be a peace conference. A peace
yes.
conference bringing all the major powers, Soviet Union, United States, Britain, France, Germany as well, by the way. And there would then be a negotiation and a general settlement to agree European peace. Now, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union remained committed to holding a peace conference. The United States, Britain, and eventually France joined them, were not, because they were worried that if there was a peace conference, because the Soviet Union was by far the most powerful country in Europe and had made the biggest contribution to the Allied victory, that it would then have a preponderant influence in the peace conference and in the eventual post war settlement. The result was that in Europe, we got the Cold War, the division of the two blocs. The, the Soviets resisted it. This is the thing people don't understand. They made a big effort for about 10 years after the Second World War ended to hold a peace conference, to have a peace conference. They gradually came to understand it wouldn't happen, but they only finally abandoned their demands for a peace conference in the mid 1960s. And that was when the Soviets accepted that there would be a division of Europe into blocs. And then they proposed, if not a peace conference, at least a security conference, which was the one that eventually met in Helsinki and produced the Helsinki Final Act, but which was not really a peace conference. So the problems of the world wars were never fully settled in Europe. And what then happened is that though you achieved a kind of stabilization in Europe because of the equivalence of powers between the two blocs, because there was no settlement, peace settlement in Europe, um, there could not really be a peace settlement anywhere else. On the contrary, there was a sense that the two great power blocs from that point onwards would treat the rest of the world as some kind of great chessboard where they would fight each other. And that was what happened during the Cold War. I remember it very well. And each side was constantly maneuvering sometimes in the most insignificant places. I think I mentioned in a program a few short while ago about Chad in the 1970s. That there was a lot of things going on in Chad and how this was seen as a strategic thing. But I mean, it really made almost no sense. But because there was no peace settlement in Europe, all of the problems in Asia were also left unresolved.
Mm.
So we had the situation where Taiwan
Mhm. Yeah.
is part of China,
Mhm.
but is separately administered. The
Mhm.
Koreas remain divided. The Japanese were left in control of all sorts of islands, which really weren't theirs, and have
Mhm.
clung to them or then passed them on to the Americans. The Americans themselves have bases in places like Guam and other places like that, which are all, products of the Second World War. We've never had a real peace. There's never been, since the start of the European crisis in 1914, a genuine, true, sustainable, treaty based peace.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, and that's lead us to today, I guess, because it's never truly
Yeah,
resolved. The World War I didn't really resolve all the issue that partially led to World War
no.
II, and World War II has its own problem that lead to
Well,
today.
World War One did lead to World War Two.
Too.
I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there was an attempt to create a peace conference in Versailles
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. But as everybody now acknowledges, it was a disaster.
Yeah.
It imposed on Germany a victor's peace, which the Allies had no power to enforce, and it had no place for Russia. It gave the Soviet Union no place in the European system. So it created a completely dysfunctional situation in Europe. And the leading French general of the time said to the French diplomats, what you've secured is not peace,
Mm-hmm.
it's an unstable 20-year truce. In 20 years' time, the war will start again. And they were absolutely right. That was exactly what happened. And then after the Second World War, we got no peace conference at all.
No.
So all the problems that have been left over from the first half of the 20th century continue to haunt us to this day.
There is no peace conference to settle all the unsettled issues. Even for the things that they did settle, like the Potsdam Declaration, the Yalta
Uh,
Conference, they don't really fully implement that either, right? Those are agreed upon
no,
terms. They're not implemented fully. And so I think
yes,
that's create
yes.
additional problem.
The
Yeah.
key thing to Yeah, you're absolutely correct. The thing to understand about Yalta, Potsdam, is that these were supposed to be provisional arrangements pending the eventual peace conference, which
Okay.
never happened.
Happen.
I mean, that's a critical point which people don't understand. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the Potsdam arrangements, for example, there was the decision, for example, to divide Germany into sectors. So
Yeah.
Soviet sector, American sector, French sector,
Mhm.
British sector. The Soviets allowed the Western Allies into Berlin, and Berlin was divided into sectors as well.
Mhm.
That created the framework for the division of Germany and ultimately for the German crisis, which has never really ended, by the way. I mean, we can see this now with the political events in Germany itself. And it also meant that Germany became, in effect, an occupied country, which to a great extent it still is.
Yeah.
But those arrangements, by definition, were intended to be temporary. The problem was that instead of being temporary, they became permanent. And again, there were supposed to be all German elections. And the Western powers cancelled them. They didn't allow all German elections to take place.
In Japan, it's almost the opposite problem. Japan also, the Potsdam also had divisions within Japan, which never happened. Well, in China, people see that because it never happened, and of course, after the World War, the U.S. really supported the Japan against China and the Russia, I mean Soviet, that make Japan feel like they didn't really lose the war. They lost it to the United States, and that's it. And the United States seems happy with them. Then, shortly after, then they feel like they are entitled for a lot of things, even though Potsdam also clearly stated that Japan does not have claim, like you said, to all the islands are surrounding. They only have claim for four major islands. That's it. They don't have claim, but they did, and it created a lot of confusion. But also, it kind of encouraged the Japanese military wing of the society continue to be there, and they sometimes they got stronger even. So that's the problem in Japan. It seems
Oh,
like.
it is exactly the problem in Japan. Again, I have some experience. I mean, I've never been to Japan. I should make that very clear. But once upon a time, in the 80s and early 90s, I worked for various Japanese businesses. I mean, did legal work for them. And I met several people who had been Japanese soldiers who had fought in China, by the way, and who had witnessed terrible things that the Japanese army had done, and who had themselves, as they admitted to me, done terrible things. And these were tormented people. And what they all told me, and because it's not always easy to get through to Japanese people, but I did. I got on very well with them, and I understood them. What they all told me was this: in after the Second World War, Japan was ready for a major change. That after the defeat in Japan, all of these soldiers felt deeply betrayed, that they'd been led to do terrible things. Many of them were Buddhists, and this was created within them a deep psychological crisis. So Japan was ready to change, to start addressing its past, to start re-looking at its own history. Most of what you think you know about Japanese history, I believe, by the way, is invented. All the samurai stories and all of this. I mean, it's a lot of it is folkloric legend, which is constructed into history. This is my view. Anyway, there was a lot of desire to do this. The Americans came along. They said, we keep the emperor, we keep the whole system intact, we protect the emperor, we don't uh, um, attach any blame to him. We make sure that all the officials protect him, because that's what they did. They all took responsibility and pretended that the emperor hadn't been involved. They all pretended that the emperor was some sort of peace-loving moderate, when the historical objective facts say otherwise. And the result was that the political and military class that had led Japan to disaster and which had carried out such appalling crimes in China and also in other places was retained and prolonged and continued in power. And of course, ever since then, they've been busy rewriting the history of the Second World War in order to protect their own role and themselves. And now it's not just themselves any longer, but what their fathers and grandfathers did, because in Japan it passes through families. You look at the families of prominent Japanese politicians, you find that they are the grandchildren or children of people who were important in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
So, they've completely reconstructed a completely false history about the Second World War and have basically indoctrinated the Japanese people into thinking this. And the result has been a Japan which is the Japan we see today, which is completely uncontrite about what it did, considers that it was in fact the victim in some mysterious
Yeah.
way. So it's never clear who it was a victim of, because they can never say that it was the Americans who dropped the nuclear weapons on them, and who remain bitterly hostile to China, whereas, as we've discussed in previous programs, China is the natural partner for Japan, obviously, and who, as a result, have been remilitarizing
Yeah.
and alarming the rest of Asia in the process.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, quite a few of the prominent Japanese politicians in the past and even current administrations, they are the children and grandchildren of the Second World War criminals. Yeah, they are. Yeah.